So our next panel this afternoon is going to be exploring water markets and water valuation in Texas. It's a topic we're increasingly hearing about as a way to help meet the increasing water needs of Texans. Our panel today is moderated by Carlos Rubinstein, currently a principal at RSA H2O. No doubt Carlos knows most of you. He also knows Texas Water, having previously served as chairman at the Texas Water Development Board, a commissioner at TCEQ, and prior to that as a deputy executive administrator. So I'm going to let Carlos introduce the remainder of our panelists. Let's welcome this panel.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here and be part of such a distinguished panel. You have their bios in your pamphlet, and we thought, because we're so compressed for time, and we don't want to have to get into the same rules that Robert got into, we all agreed on that, that we'd want to get into the discussion about the topic, the markets and the proper valuation. But with us today are Sharlene Leurig. She is the brand new CEO of Texas Water Trade. Look up her website. She just posted it, about a week ago, and doing fantastic work there. Gabe Collins is with Baker Botts. He's a fellow in Energy and Environmental Regulatory Affairs at Rice University. The Baker Institute. But you're a fellow.
Yes,
yeah.
I'm not with Baker Botts.
Oh, okay, he's not with Baker Botts, but he is a fellow. They endow his position. Okay, we have the first controversy of the panel. And then Harry Seeley is a principal of WestWater Research, Inc. So help me welcome the panel. We're going to be talking about the conditions that exist or do not exist, and the reasons why they do or do not for water markets, with a special focus, obviously, on groundwater and the role that proper evaluation of water comes into play. The way we're going to be doing this panel is I'm going to ask a set of questions to each of the panelists in order. We're going to spend about 10 minutes on each topic. Each of the panelists at the end of each topic will get to comment on what the principal speaker has talked about. Then we'll have some general questions, and then we'll open it up for Q&A from you and those that are also watching online as well. So Sharlene, we'll start with you. I know you've been doing a tremendous amount of work, and your expertise is in water markets and sustainable management of water. From the work that you've done with Austin and across the state, can you share with us your view of the water market conditions in Texas today?
Thanks, Carlos. So just a bit more on Texas Water Trade and why we're talking about water markets. We're a nonprofit. We operate statewide. And really our mission is to make sure that every Texan now and in the future has access to clean water, whether that's in their homes or in their rivers. And we think that in a state that values private property as much as Texas, that markets are a core tool in achieving that reality. So we're looking at markets both in the groundwater as well as the surface water domains. I think that those are kind of boundaries that really meant something in our past, and they're increasingly kind of disintegrating as we look at new opportunities to bring on firm yield in the state, and hopefully we'll talk about that and what that means for different kind of organizations and entities that the state has created to manage water in the past, whether that's river authorities or groundwater conservation districts. So Texas, just to take a step back for a second and look at how water markets are working in other places in the western United States and where we are in relationship to them in terms of the amount of trading that is happening in any given year. Texas is still, by some metrics, pretty underdeveloped in terms of the extent to which water markets are used as a tool. So one really kind of quick way of capturing that is actually through data and analysis that's provided by WestWater Research, Harry's outfit over here. Just looking in the year 2015, Texas had about $24 million in water trades. It's only about 4% of what was traded in California in that same year. We're not that different from California in terms of our economic size. In contrast, we were trading about twice as much as the state of Oregon. We were trading about a third of what was being traded in Colorado. So it kind of gives you a sense of where we are. And I think one of the questions that I ask is, what would be the explanatory factors for that? I think there are a few. I think one is that in Texas, we still have relative water abundance, especially as you look at groundwater resources, and that being kind of the places where people go when surface waters are not reliable because of drought. I think part of it is that Unlike if you look at the Colorado River Basin in the west, or you look at North and South California, where you have a lot of cities that have kind of inflexible demand that are also have political will and ability to buy water, and that are moving water out of basins. So a lot of the water trades that are happening in those places are between farmers and cities that are able to move water beyond their basin, and that is more limited here in Texas, not only because of the junior rights provision that I know is on Carlos's mind a lot when it comes to surface transfers interbasin, but also because really as we have gotten down deeper into the data on how surface waters are held currently, a lot of the agricultural water rights are actually already consolidated and held by river authorities. So the most reliable surface rights in many of the basins where you might see a high growth in demand and need for reliable water supply, you don't have that same opportunity set. Although you may, if you're looking at groundwater that's used by agriculture, and there you start falling into some of the challenges that we see about actually using markets as a way of transferring water from one place to another, especially in short-term arrangements, in that you're dealing with two different regulatory systems. If you're trying to capture groundwater, but maybe move it through a surface water body to go into a storage reservoir or something like that. So those are some of the challenges, or at least some of the explanations for why markets might not be as robust here in Texas as they are in other places in the West. But we still see really vibrant markets, and I know that Harry and Gabe are going to talk about those in the Permian, in the Edwards, on the Rio Grande. Just really briefly, some comments. I don't know that water markets always means the same thing. There's no real one-size-fits-all, because in some ways you could say, well, okay, you have these high liquidity, almost spot markets that are possible in a place like the Rio Grande. You have shorter-term arrangements that are made possible in a regulated, very consolidated market like the Edwards Aquifer, where you have a central clearinghouse, a central administrator there in the form of the Edwards Aquifer Authority. But I would certainly call the Carrizo probably one of the most active water markets in the state today, even though it looks very, very different from those other two markets. You don't really have a central clearinghouse, but you certainly have a lot of interest and acquisitions that have gone into long-term purchase agreements. So wrapping up, comment on current state of markets, I think we have a huge opportunity to grow the role that markets can play in the state in providing reliable water supplies that flexibly reallocate water, not over the long term necessarily. We're already showing that they can do that, but that are allowing users to be able to capture water in times of relative scarcity and to transfer water from sectors that have flexibility in their demand for short durations over to sectors that have less flexibility in demand. That really can't happen, though, I think, without a really active role by the state entities that have been designated by the legislature to help to manage water, and that's groundwater districts and river authorities, and I hope we have a chance to talk more about what that could look like.
All right. Sharlene brought up my position on the junior provision on surface water right. I think it leads us into the discussion we're going to have with Gabe next. The reason I so dislike the junior provision is that I think it serves as a way of disincentivizing market transactions and also devaluing the water. I think when you take all of the variables that are required to arrive at a proper valuation of water, you need to look at the things that we've done to also shift the focus to another source of water, or we have taken an incentive away from actually developing markets. Gabe, you've done a lot of work on evaluating different methodologies to arriving at values of water and what really is within those numbers. You and I were talking about it in the back of the room while we were hearing Robert Mace explain the difference between open marriage and open data. So somehow our discussion was a little bit more attuned to why we're here today. But can you tell us a little bit about the work you've been doing on the different methodologies to arrive at proper valuations? What is it that you're finding? And then also get into what are you finding that exists to allow you to get to a proper valuation, and what are we not taking into consideration yet that we should to arrive at a proper valuation of water?
Definitely. Thank you, Carlos. And thank you to all of y'all for being here. I always feel bad going after Sharlene. She's a lot more organized. She has these great notes and other things I can see out of the corner of my eye here. But to get right to your question, Carlos, I guess this will maybe tie it back in slightly with Robert's remarks on open marriage. As you think about when you're comparing one type of fruit to another. Apples to apples is always great. Apples to oranges, you can kind of make something work. Apples to garlic is a little bit tougher, and maybe the garlic is why your spouse wants an open marriage. But I think when we're looking at this data, often, when we're comparing water transactions, I think probably the first and foremost method, if you're trying to value groundwater, and I think we do this for a number of reasons, is using the comparable transactions method, where basically I see, okay, you two did a transaction, you did a transaction with her, and those two did a transaction. And so you start kind of stacking them against each other and applying different adjustment factors. And you almost never find something that's apples to apples. Probably the only place you're going to find apples to apples in Texas right now is on the groundwater side, the Edwards. I think some of these Rio Grande Valley surface water transactions, something we have a fairly established and, no pun intended, liquid market. I think out in the Permian Basin oil field as well, that's the underappreciated place where there's a really vibrant spot market, but it's a very different spot market for water because you're filling frac pit to frac pit, and nobody wants a long-term contract, even if they had a loaded gun pointed at them, because they're exposed to oil price volatility and all these other factors. But I think some of these things we think about when we're adjusting, and these would be things I'd apply in my scholarly work or in private advisory work that I do as well, is, for instance, is there infrastructure connectivity? Because if I have water and you guys in the back corner there are dry, if we don't have a pipe or some sort, at least a right of way to start with linking with us, I'm gonna have to watch y'all parched and suffer for a while. And it's a bummer of a situation, but if you can't move that wet water, unless you're in a common aquifer like the Edwards, where you can do a virtual transaction, anything else you really need infrastructure. It kind of brings you back to the idea that Representative Larson brought up in the 2015 legislative session, the proposal for doing a study on a hydrovascular grid throughout Texas. I think that's a really big move and tall order. I would argue that we're going to see it in the oil field before we see it anywhere else, and parts of the Permian Basin are already heading down that road, whether some of the specific operators realize it or not. But so infrastructure connectivity, what's the quality of your water? Do you have to treat it? How deep is it coming from? How much energy do you have to invest in pumping it? What do the capital costs of your infrastructure look like? What are the markets you're sending to? Because it's a pretty clear reality that as you move from agriculture to municipalities to industrial activities like fracking, there's often an order of magnitude, basically a factor of 10 in difference as to what people can pay and still make their venture work out. So that's going to be a critical one. And there's some others as well, but those I think are some of the really, really core things you'd look at.
Earlier you were sharing with me the value of a recent transaction that is well known in Texas, and how much of that was actually the purchased water and how much of that was the conveyance cost. So could you share that data with the group as well? So, because I think it drives the point that you just made.
So I'll put in the plug for the Baker Institute and say that all of the data I'm going to be talking about here, I have multiple presentations that if you search my name in Baker Institute, you can basically download all that you want. If anybody has trouble going to sleep tonight, I'd direct you right there. You can find all the lullabies you need. But Carlos we're talking about the Vista Ridge transaction. You're looking at a value of about $2,000 an acre foot delivered for that water. Over 60% of that is conveyance cost and power and all the other things that go in. And out of that roughly $2,000, about $460 an acre foot is the actual conveyance price of the water. The landowners see about 10% of that as royalty, but it kind of gives you a sense of how water is very different than almost any other commodity market we think about. You think about crude oil, you have an underlying value right now of give or take $50 a barrel. To move that from Midland all the way down to Houston, maybe $4 or $5 or less if you're on pipe, well under 10% of the value of the commodity. Soybeans from southern Brazil, and we've run these numbers, you have to truck them over 2,000 kilometers of just really crappy road, and it's still the highest we found is a logistics cost that was about a third of the underlying commodity value. Anyone want to take a guess what it is for the Vista Ridge water? I think I've already given you all the numbers. You need to figure it out. Not so 300%. And so it kind of gives you a sense of just how radically different water is.
And I think that this discussion is relevant to another aspect of it. As you know, we're going to get dry again, and just as we got as close as we did in 2011 with the commission, and I was sitting on the commission at the time, on having to entertain emergency orders for the regulatory redistribution of surface water. And we've never done it in Texas. It exists in law, it exists in the water code. I believe it's section 11139. And it requires that if you're going to do an emergency reallocation of water, that the commission is supposed to value what the impact is to the persons that you're taking the water from, and what the just compensation should be. And so I don't think we're far from a day where we'll have to have the ability to make those computations, whether it's in surface water, whether we're valuing water in place, whether we're valuing the water to the area of origin, where the transaction is originating. We don't talk about those variables. We simply want to arrive at a price of what a willing buyer and a willing seller are willing to pay for the water to allow it to transfer. But are we capturing all of the variables that need to go in there to get us to the true value of that water? So before I get to Harry, because I particularly want to hear about the work he's done in the West, I think it's relevant to this point. I was wondering if you all had any questions about what we've shared so far with the audience.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think that latter point that you just raised, Carlos, is so important, and I know it's caused huge policy debates and discussions in other parts of the West, especially where there's been acquisition of water in rural areas whose economies are primarily agriculture to urbanization. And I think, we're taking data that are available through, comparable kind of water transactions that have happened in various basins, and looking at also commodity prices and other sorts of values that aren't just water, to be able to infer what the value of water could be for a farmer whose water we might want to have for, let's say, environmental flows. And we could come up with an agreement with that farmer that could make him or her whole in a given year. But that doesn't necessarily provide compensation to the area of origin if that's happening at a scale where you have farm workers, you have people who sell, different types of products that you need to farm, and who are not able to actually make their sales in any given year, right? And those are the sorts of large regional impacts that have been felt in other places of the West. So I'm really interested in the way that mitigation funds that are emerging in places like the Carrizo to deal with, draining of the hydrostatic pressure and people having to deepen their wells. I'm interested in how those sorts of funds can help to compensate whole regions for the impacts that go beyond what might be felt by any specific landowner.
So I think maybe what we're saying, if you want to slightly joke about it, is since you apparently can now grow hemp in Texas, we want to reach these values before the farmers start producing CBD oil and want $1,000 an acre foot for their water. But all joking aside, I think this is a really critical question, because we can go and calculate based on what somebody's growing or how much they sold for fracking or any other sort of potential baseline metric that we can maybe mutually agree on to say, okay, this is a reasonable replacement cost, maybe for lack of a better term, if that water is needed for another use. Now, Texas is very different than the other Western states because you're not generally, at least on the groundwater side, it's real private property. So it's not just something you can allocate easily by administrative fiat. And it's also something that if the price is right, I mean, and we see this over and over in the Permian, is landowners want to do business. It's just being able to agree on that price. But I think in an exigent situation, if somebody's willing to pay, and we've seen examples of this with Midland going out and sourcing water from private landowners after the last drought, it can definitely be done. But, I think the hardest one maybe is thinking about, what is kind of the intrinsic value of water in place? Whether you're wanting to preserve resource for future generations, whether you're wanting to manage your withdrawal costs and, different hydrostatic pressures and things like that. And I think we're still very far. I mean, what I would say is in terms of being able to figure replacement values, if you start with 0 being no ability and 100, you've got it perfect and, you know, you're a rocket scientist, I'd say we're probably at 60 or 70 on that spectrum. But I think when we start thinking about sort of in-place intrinsic value, I mean, if you ask me personally, if you were deposing me, I'd say I'm probably at like 5 or 6%. I think I'm pretty good at this. So, you know, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts. You may be at, you know, 12% or something. So,
well, I think that certainly one of the reasons that there aren't more market trades in Texas is because of the political opposition to them. And we heard some of that in the first session today about a proposed groundwater export project, and that's certainly not the only one that's out there, and not the only one that's going to be presented in the future. So really, that's part of the reason, I think, is political opposition, and that's not unique to Texas. That's everywhere. Water leaving the area of origin always is an uphill battle, and I don't see a way around that, an easy way around it anyway. I also think that Sharlene's point about, you know, there are many areas where water is still available and abundant, and the fact that a lot of the groundwater, take the Vista Ridge project for example, a lot of that groundwater that was aggregated as a part of that project through royalty agreements and then ultimately developed into a pipeline project was not really water that was being actively used for irrigation, for any other purpose, and that's unique to Texas. You know, usually to develop a project like that, you need to get an irrigator to fallow his ground, either for 1 year or forever. And that's a much harder conversation to have, rather than a royalty to a right that's really not being actively used. And you know, all this, I guess, speaks to, I guess, why I was interested in markets and have been for the last 20 years. It's this intersection between hydrology, regulation, law, politics. And I think what's often left out of that equation is psychology. So we have really nascent markets in Texas in most areas. You talk to a potential seller, you're trying to buy his water. He's an agricultural user, long ways from a municipality, maybe a long ways from the oil fields. He's still going to want $1 a barrel for his water, you know. And so part of it is just information. Going to the big data discussion, you know, what is the information base that people have as far as the value of water, the price of water at the source, and it's very limited in Texas. It's tough, and so big data, there's a role to fill there. You know, you can go to Zillow and see what the value of your home is, but you can't go to something equivalent and try to discern that value from an independent and credible source. So all those things I think are particular challenges, but to me, the politics, the social dynamics of water, and the lack of price information within those markets are some of the biggest factors that are deterring market participation.
Yeah, could you speak a little bit about the work that you've done in the West to arrive at the proper valuation of water and distinguish that with what you're seeing in Texas? You spoke a little bit about that, but tell us a little bit more about the work you've done in the other Western states. A lot of us rely on the work that you all do to arrive at proper valuation. I think it would be beneficial to the audience to hear that as well.
Sure, thank you. So WestWater Research, we're a small consulting firm, been in operation for around 20 years now, and started out really in the Northwest, helping NGOs and power companies with mitigation responsibilities to figure out how to negotiate or price water right transactions to improve flows in rivers for endangered fish. And so that really, as far as environmental markets goes, the Pacific Northwest was really the birthplace for environmental water right transactions. So we learned a lot through that process. Mainly, we learned a lot about agriculture and about how to value water in agriculture. We also learned a lot about how to negotiate, because the first question we got when we started was, I don't care what you're going to tell me about the value of my water for agriculture. You may have a nice spreadsheet model that you can use, but I want to know what the value of the water for fish is. And so, those are the conversations, the values, the different value chains for water, and how it affects those negotiations that are particularly important, and it influences how you approach your valuation of a particular water right. So we've since obviously expanded from the Pacific Northwest, working in all 17 in 17 Western states, and valuing water in all of those states in different market contexts. And in each state, in each region within each state, there's many significant differences. So Texas, for example, you tend to see large transactions. So, you look at Vista Ridge is a good example. You look at Garwood. You look at sort of these bellwether transactions that everyone knows about. They're huge relative to most transactions in other states. And part of that is because of the fact that in order to do a groundwater project, you need to have scale, particularly if you're distant from the market that you're trying to deliver it to. And Texas is uniquely positioned to really, I think, develop that scale for groundwater. Most other states, it would be difficult, if not impossible, just due to the layout of the water rights on the ground, as well as the regulatory constraints against moving groundwater from one region to another. So all those are important to think about, the regulation and its influence, but I think going back to some of the work that Gabe's done, it's easy to see the value of water at the end of the pipe. That's what's most visible. So what is that water being priced for municipal uses? What is it being priced for oil and gas uses? It's much harder to get back to what's it worth at the source, particularly when that source may be very distant from the market that it's serving. And so there's this risk that, in fact, you're assigning value to the source water that really is associated with the technology and conveyance used to get the water from the source to the conveyance. So just a quick story, we were asked by a private equity group to value a proposed groundwater project. And this happened to be in Texas, and this happened to be a brackish water project. And the sellers, or the project proponents at this point, were saying, okay, well, we're just going to sell the permit to the groundwater. What we've identified is the value opportunity through this treatment technology that we're going to utilize that's going to take out all the bad stuff and, in fact, take out some minerals that we can then sell in an ancillary market, as well as deliver under a long-term contract to local municipal water providers. Well, what in fact they were doing was valuing the technology, not the water permit. And they didn't have a proprietary right to that technology, so really there wasn't anything that the private equity group could invest in as far as the underlying property right in terms of the water right itself.
As we sit here and we talk about these issues, I'm reminded that it's been 22 years since the passage of Senate Bill 1, which created the planning process that we follow today. And one of the principal pillars of Senate Bill 1 is that we could meet our future water needs through voluntary transactions. And we've fallen short on that. And you gave two examples of large transactions. One of those you couldn't repeat today because of the junior provision. Garwood, you can't do that again, right? And there's been, during interim sessions and even during legislative sessions, a lot of hearings about the status of markets, and you've all have talked about the issues associated there. And one of the places where I think we get hung up, kind of like a chicken and egg deal, is what do we need first? Do we need to identify a equitable way of valuing water, taking all of the characteristics in place. Value of water left in place. The value of how you arrive at properly being able to determine the economic impact to an area of origin, the economic benefit to the person that's going to benefit from that import of water, the benefit to the environment if we're actually able to protect the water and leave it in place. So what is your position on this chicken and egg conundrum that we seem to be in, that we want a vibrant water market? It was contemplated under Senate Bill 1, but to arrive at a proper market, do we need to have proper valuations? For me, I'll tell you that I feel that we need to first get the valuation right. But I'd like to hear your all's thoughts on can those two occur at the same time? How do you see that? How have you seen it in the West as well? So if y'all can just address it as you all go on.
Yeah, sure.
Go ahead.
Sure. So, I think that more has to be built into the policies from the local level up to the state level statute to ensure that as we develop these sources of water and as we're incentivizing the movement of water, that we're really being honest about the outcomes that we're trying to achieve. And I think the first thing that we need to be honest about and need to properly value is that our groundwater aquifers and our rivers are really important pieces of infrastructure. And that if we fundamentally change the function of those natural systems of infrastructure, if we pursue development in areas that take what is currently coupled hydrology, where you have groundwater becoming base flow of rivers, that if you're not properly accounting for that and you're not leading to a long-term outcome that's providing reliable water for users. And if you look at where the vast majority of urban water comes from today, it's coming from surface water. So as we start to see more groundwater being the place of origin for new urban development, I think if we were honestly doing an accounting, we would find out that we're not necessarily creating new water in the state through those sorts of projects. I think the same is very clearly true for environmental flows, and the biggest concern that I have around that is trying to prevent the state of Texas from encountering the same kind of shock of water supply disruption that Southern California saw with an endangered species listing. And I know that that's on the minds of a lot of people when it comes to freshwater mussels and the like, and I think that's the other place where you have to really do an honest accounting. Do you get there through economic value? I don't know that you have to get there from an economic valuation or a pricing, but I do think to the points that were made in the prior panel about data, we really need to be very clear as we talk about this in the policy domain about what those trade-offs are and what trajectory we're headed down, and have better data to support an analysis that helps us understand, are we producing new water or are we taking water from one user and we're shifting it over to another? Because when I look at a lot of projects that are being developed right now at very high capital cost with very high O&M ongoing, it's to replace the functionality of natural systems that we're providing that value and that service to other users. It might be a different user that's paying for it, but that's the kind of whack-a-mole game that I see happening.
Yeah, and I would actually agree with a lot of those points. I'm going to sort of bifurcate my answer here into groundwater and surface water. So I think as we think about groundwater, there's definitely some ways to start closing the bid-ask spread. And I say this because I'm presuming, and this is based on my limited experience and conversations I've had with water owners in various parts of the state, is if there's the right opportunity presented, for instance, to divert water from agricultural use into a municipal application, if there's the right price and the right contractual structure, I think people are pretty open to that. I think data transparency, and Harry was really going down this road, that helps get us there, because if I'm having a bilateral negotiation and I'm a municipal water buyer and I'm going out to a landowner, there's probably going to be a fair amount of suspicion there. I think, if you have if you have a grouping of landowners and leases, kind of like what was done with the Vista Ridge aggregation, you may have various suspicions and so forth. And if you're dealing with a really big landowner, like some of these guys we see down in South Texas and in West Texas, they're frighteningly sophisticated. I mean, you almost hate to go negotiate with them because you're wondering how many marbles you're still going to have left when you leave the room. I think every farmer and rancher in here probably appreciates that. I think the more transparency we have, the less emphasis there is on the trust me part, and the more we can turn to objective benchmarks. The same way that if I were to strike a contract with any of you guys out in the audience there, guys or gals, to lend money, we'd probably benchmark our interest rate to LIBOR or some sort of Wall Street Journal stated rate. I don't think we're going to get to that type of market for groundwater in Texas, but something where you're starting to talk more objective benchmarks. It makes it easier to do transactions, and it starts to set us up to kind of go back up the pipe from the point of use. And, we have a pretty good library of contracts now. I think we're going to open source all that in part because that end value is the easy part. It's figuring out, how the water, what it may be worth in different applications and under different conditions. Another thing I think should be seriously thought about in the context of big water infrastructure projects is the idea of potentially allowing more significant third-party interconnectivity with the trunk water line, something like Vista Ridge or any other big pipe project. This is old hat to anyone who's in the oil and gas business, but when you do that, it totally transforms how things are done, because what it does is those crippling infrastructure costs that you were rightly referring to earlier, it starts to reduce that burden. If I'm sitting on a big pool of water here and one of these guys and gals in the back of the room there wants water, we run a big pipe through here. Some of y'all in the middle before may not have relished the idea of a several $100 million investment, but if we suddenly have a universe where you spend a few million and can connect your water into that pipe, that's transformative. Surface water, my remarks, I'm going to defer much more to Carlos on that because he knows about 100 times as much as I do. But when I look at the interbasin transfer situation, the fact that we don't see Sabine River water and water from some of these other parts of eastern Texas that are very wet heading west to drier areas is totally insane. And I think, to be really blunt about it, there are certain political interests in those parts of the state that have taken a proprietary interest in this water that by law is property of all the people in Texas. And I think they forget that. I think they do well to remember that, and maybe they need a reminder as we move forward.
Yeah, thank you. Those are really good points. I just want to tear off something you just said, Gabe, about sort of price transparency, information, accessibility. So WestWater has a database, a geodatabase of transactions throughout the West. And it's maybe has 30,000 individual transactions that are water-only deals with good information. I mean, we take a lot of time and effort to manage and populate that database. A couple years ago, we thought, well, maybe we should make that accessible. Let's put our money where our mouth is, and we think price transparency is important. So we piggybacked on top of an existing platform because we didn't want to go through the expense of developing our own online portal for the data, and made it accessible in a very stripped down version. So, confidentiality is an issue. People report price information to us, and they're not going to want to see their name attached to the deal. But what we did was essentially had a dot on a map that said, here's a deal. It's a lease or a sale of a water right. It happened in this year, involved this much water, and the price was X dollars an acre foot. So we thought, well, this would be great. It's going to be good business for us. Going to provide information to others, generate business opportunity. Well, the only calls we got were people angry that we put the data up and made it available. And so, just a word of caution. And again, going back to sort of the psychology of all of it, water is, I think, the most emotional asset I know of. And so the best intentions really can sometimes come back to haunt you.
As we've been sitting here and exchanging our ideas, I've been noticing that Leah's been getting a bunch of questions because she's been writing a whole bunch of cards. So how about we turn it over to her and give the audience an opportunity to ask their own questions?
If anyone wants to go to the mic, please feel free.
Okay. If you all didn't hear, if you want to go to the microphones, feel free, but she has also received, I know, some questions that she has. Let's start with this gentleman here. If you're present, you get priority. How's that?
Absolutely.
Thank you. An interesting discussion, and I appreciate it very much. One of the things that has amazed me is the fact that as these deals go down and these large amounts of money are spent to retain water rights so they can go out and market it, they can't give you a cost per 1,000 gallons to buy that water. And so I struggle with, if you come into my office and you're going to sell me water, my first question is, how much per 1,000? And they've got the water over here, so I think they've got it locked up, but you know, the problems, like you mentioned, getting the water to where you're going to sell it to, has a big impact on cost.
It does. Do y'all want to comment on that? I agree with the sentiment.
So I think you just made a very good sales pitch for certain groundwater conservation districts to be maybe a little more business orientated in how they make their export decisions.
I agree with you. I mean, and you see it not only in the transactions for raw water, whether it's surface, and in particular groundwater, but you also see it in development of new sources of water. I can give you a price at the fence. The harder one is what's it going to take to actually get it to you for use? And it does have an impact on the cost. You have any questions for the group?
I do, and this one kind of piggybacks on that a little bit. Are there any cases in Texas or elsewhere where someone is taking a deliberate look at the economic impacts of transporting groundwater out of an area of origin, presumably on the basin of origin? And maybe
aware of it?
Should they be?
Harry? Harry perked up.
Yeah, those studies have happened and are ongoing. In particular, they tend to happen around acquisition programs, so water right acquisition programs that are designed to retire one use of that water in exchange for that water being conveyed to another use. It could be an environmental acquisition program. So it's, you know, the desire to put more water in the river and pay farmers to take less water out. Now, those economic studies have happened. They have quantified the impacts to the local community, jobs, income, you know, both in terms of direct farm employment, but also some of those ancillary, indirect, related businesses like the tractor dealer, the fertilizer dealer. So it's sort of rolled all that up into okay, here's the impact. But then the big question is, okay, so what do you do with that? You know, I have not seen that information be used in a meaningful way to either support or modify an existing acquisition program. So I think those studies can have value. It's just I've not seen them take it to the next step in terms of how does that relate to a proposed project in particular.
And I would say I would really love to see more discussions around how we value the economic opportunity for especially rural areas of the state to provide storage for other areas of the state where they need places to bank their surface water allocation. I've served for the last 6 years on the task force, city council appointed task force in Austin, which has developed its 100-year water supply plan. ASR is a really big component of our plan. We're out there currently looking for places where we can bank our Highland Lakes allocation. There should be many more projects like that that are being developed, hopefully not just by cities and retail providers, but by river authorities, I think even by GCDs. And that's, I think, a really important conversation for groups like this to have about what is the role in a groundwater conservation district in actually helping the state pursue new forms of infrastructure that provide firm yield and that look at aquifers not just as banks of water where there's one direction of flow, the water comes out of it, but really taking a hard look at how do we try to cooperatively create opportunities for greater managed aquifer recharge. And so it's not just I think the policy discussion shouldn't just stop at what's the economic impact of water being extracted from those communities. This is a really important question, but how do we actually position groundwater districts to play a productive role in meeting the state's needs in an economically reciprocal way?
Just as a quick follow-up, if you're interested in looking at a study that did just that, there's a transaction between Palo Verde Irrigation District and Metropolitan Water District in California, is very well known. There were a number of economic impact studies done. The outcome of those was really just a negotiated agreement for the buyer to commit funding for local economic development in Palo Verde. But those studies really didn't have anything to do with the level of mitigation funding or establishing the level of mitigation funding for the area of origin.
So, and this will give me a chance to pull back a few of the darts I just threw at some of y'all in the GCD community there. So this is an area actually that we're starting to look at, and I think you could expect some research, and I also suspect that as we go down some of these second and third order aspects of how the economic value, not just the economic value, but kind of the holistic value of water in some of these areas, particularly as we think about a rural district where water may be transferred into a municipality somewhere nearby. I think this may be something, despite the darts I throw at you, you may find that we're closer than you would have thought. So, we'll share it with you as we get deeper into that research.
That was a self-redeeming comment right there. Leah, do we have time for one more?
We absolutely do, and there were
Okay.
two that kind of go together, so I'm going to ask them together. What about groundwater markets in particular is different? And then what regulatory changes are needed to encourage groundwater markets?
So with surface water markets, you still have to maybe wait for a year even to make a really administrative change of adding a beneficial use. So if we are talking to a farmer about adding in-stream flows as a beneficial use, that's something that they can do without having to forfeit irrigation as a beneficial use, but it gives them the opportunity to make money in dry years by being paid to keep water in stream, right? That could take you a year. If you want to change your point of diversion, it could take even longer than that. But there's a clear way of pursuing that administrative change that enables a market. When you think about that opportunity set within the groundwater space in Texas, it is far more difficult to enable those sorts of kind of short-term opportunities to trade water for different purposes within the span of a single year. Now, once I've added the beneficial use, I might have to wait for a year, but then as long as that permit amendment doesn't change in the surface water domain, that farmer can in any year choose to sell their water to me for fish, right? With groundwater, it seems that in many districts, the process of being able to modify your right to be able to make it available for a different use than what you have had historically can be incredibly burdensome or potentially even impossible depending upon what you're trying to change it toward. And I think as we consider how we enable groundwater markets as a way of creating financial incentive to keep water in place so that the deals that are done are not exclusively about extracting that resource permanently from the place of origin, we really have to think about how does permitting and management by a district adapt so that you're enabling those sorts of short-term trades, so that if I'm a user that wants water 1 in every 5 years, I have the ability to do that without having to make a permanent transaction that I'm going to have to pay hand over fist in terms of capex and opex forever, when maybe I don't want that water every year. I want it every 5 or every 10.
Just very quick. I would very much agree with what Sharlene is saying. I guess to put it in kind of a nutshell is you're thinking, do you want to do business California style where there's layer upon layer of permitting and bureaucracy and other things that complicate your capital investments, or does a district want to take the approach of we're going to be like Hong Kong or Dubai and we just want to be a really freewheeling environment that it encourages business? And we understand that there may be trade-offs in doing so, but I think what it comes down to is there are going to be some pretty significant value calculations and assessments that are frankly going to have to be made at a much higher philosophical level than just looking at dollars, cents, because those philosophical assessments on how we might approach exports, how we approach certain infrastructure issues, how we approach switching from one use to another, those are going to intimately affect your dollars and cents decisions at the end of the day.
Yeah, I was just going to say that in most markets that we work in, the groundwater markets are by far the most efficient. It's difficult to trade surface water. Try moving the water right upstream, you'll find out. You have priority dates to think about, reliability issues to think about. With groundwater, you can essentially create a credit, a uniform commodity that could be traded anywhere within that basin, provided it doesn't impact other users and all the other protections that you need to have embedded in that type of trade. But in theory, I think there's no reason why GCDs, even bigger than GCDs, the state of Texas, couldn't develop groundwater markets in a way that they've been developed in other places, like Arizona, for example.
Great. Well, let's give this panel a round of applause. Thank you, Carlos, and our panelists.